you have another superstar coming in. Well, she is a superstar, but another one of your fans, you're like being like really excited about this. You're just excited about all of them. What am I talking about? But would you like to hit off with our next amazing speaker?
I would love to announce our next speaker. So our next speaker was once a privy queen at the Renaissance Fair. And if you don't know, that means she was an outhouse attendant. But since then, worked as the CTO of Wikipedia, the chief open source evangelist for Sun, a senior director of open source strategy for Intel, and another person that just makes me feel like I need to work harder because of everything that she's done.
Right?
Yeah, just a little bit. She is the VP of Special Initiatives at NearForm, and the name of her talk is why innersource is a critical component of FOSS sustainability. Please help me welcome the great Denise Cooper.
Hi there. Hi there. How you doing? My name's Denise Cooper, and I am the VP of Special Initiatives for NearForm. And I'm going to talk to you today about why I believe that innersource is going to be very critical to FOSS sustainability in the long term. So there's my Twitter handle if you are tweeting, and let's get started. First of all, to level set, this is Tim O'Reilly, and he coined the term innersource in 2000. He was working for a company on the board that he had helped fund the founding of. It was called collab.net, and it was founded by one of the two people that started Apache. And they wanted to teach the Apache way to companies, proprietary companies inside the firewall, to help them, get better outcomes from their engineering. And they did have some successes, but in the long run, in 2000, open source hadn't been running long enough for people to believe that it was a better way to write software. And so the company pivoted. They still exist, but they don't do a ton of innersource anymore. But then we won. About 5 years ago, I noticed that, having been in open source since the beginning, I noticed that people were not fighting us anymore. Everybody wanted to join us, and open source was the way that things were being built. In fact, if you think of a company that is newer than Google, they wouldn't exist without open source. Google would not exist without open source. So that's great, right? Well, looking at sustainability of open source, I started wondering what we could do to increase the number of open source developers as maintainer fatigue started to creep in. And so when I started working at PayPal, it occurred to me that teaching them how to collaborate in open source style inside the company before we tried to build communications outside the company and communities was maybe a good strategy. So in 2005, I started talking about it. I did it because I think something like 85% of the world's engineers are still not working in an open source way. I think of that as they're in the salt mines, because the way that we do open source is so freeing for individual developers. It's empowering, it's educational, you learn stuff, you grow, you can learn anything you want, you can get facility in any part of our code base. And it seems like that would be a good thing inside of companies as well. So I've sort of dedicated the last 5 years and the next 5 years to getting innersource to be a household word and more companies to use it. And you're going to hear more about that in a minute. These are some of the reasons why companies engage in innersource. And I'll get to the open source bit in a second. But when you have over specialization in a company, that's where just a few people know everything about a key piece of the code, but the rest of the company doesn't really know much about it. That creates silos. And that ownership culture can be a good choice at some point in a company's evolution. But if you let it go for too long, you start seeing technical debt pile up. And that's, denoted by the rust in this picture. Basically, the silo starts becoming a liability. And for many reasons, because it's dangerous to have so few people know everything about a really important piece of code when nobody else knows. Everybody knows about a company where there's some piece of code that all the people that used to maintain it have left, and nobody knows what it does, and they're all terrified to touch it. So that can be really limiting as you're trying to grow or expand your services or to scale out. So the number one reason people go after innersource is because they're trying to reduce silos. And the other reason, besides the accretion of technical debt, that silos are dangerous is they create bottlenecks. It's not the only structure that can do this in an engineering organization, but if your resources are not being fully utilized, people are sitting around waiting for somebody else to get something done because they've made a feature request and nothing's changed yet. Or especially if your executives are getting involved in escalating the priority of specific features or specific requests, that's you've got a bottleneck problem. So this is the number two reason. It's the number one reason that PayPal started doing it, however. And there's a book about that GitHub has turned into the most important or popular non-code asset on GitHub. It's called Getting Started with innersource. And you can go get a copy of it there. It's 26 pages. And it's all about a bottleneck story. Another reason that people do innersource is because in their company, they've over executed and everybody does the same thing and they do it perfectly, which is great for maintaining the quality of something that you already know how to do, but it's pretty limiting to figure out how to innovate. And innersource has been used successfully by at least one major company to increase innovation. And I'm going to tell you more about that later. And then quickly, the last reason that people resort to innersource inside of companies is because, and this is just a fact of life, as your company ages, the people that you can hire to work are younger and younger. And now we have a whole generation of digital natives who expect transparency, they expect openness, they expect agency. And the way that traditional engineering is conducted is sort of soul-effacing to them, which you might think isn't important, but if you've spent a lot of money selecting them and hiring them and training them, to have them leave sooner than you want them to is not a good thing. So there are companies who are trying to modernize or transform themselves. Agile was the first wave of this, but we've seen successive waves, and innersource is definitely one of them. Okay, luckily there is GitHub. And of course, this is GitHub Satellite. So thanks for the Octocat, guys. But there are other tools you could use. GitHub is just the one that's most popular and most associated with innersource. And they are starting to write features that are really supportive of the innersource experience. Unfortunately, a lot of companies go get GitHub Enterprise hoping to get innersource events to happen inside the company, even if they don't have a name for that. They want more code reuse, or they want, cross-company understanding of the code base or something. But then when they get it inside, they cripple those potentials by mirroring whatever permission structure was in their previous code management system. Something like, well, those people must be excluded for a reason. So just getting GitHub Enterprise and standing it up is not enough to get your culture to change. And that's why there's room for people like me to talk about innersource to you. So this is the innersource logo. As I say, in 2015, I started talking about innersource, taking a big career risk, frankly, because open source advocates were not into innersource at that point because they want more open source code. And to them, it feels like a detour. But I realized in my consulting practice that most of the companies who were going to come to open source naturally had already done so. Now, this doesn't count new companies, but I'm talking about the existing companies. And remember, I'm worried about that 85% that are stuck in the salt mines. So I thought that if we could, use innersource as a not painless, because it's definitely a trick to get it implemented in your company well, but to get companies started on their innersource journey inside the firewall, so they're not risking brand embarrassment if they get it wrong. And I posited that would lead to more, not less, open source. And I think that that's true. So now we're to the question, is innersource going to actually help FOSS sustainability? Is it really going to be, hands across the ocean? And I think so. Here's some evidence. First of all, today, most open source developers work for a company that pays them to do open source. Now, 20 years ago, open source was mostly a hobbyist thing. You did your day job and then you came home at night and you worked on your open source project. It's been a long time since that was true. And I personally think that that's a really positive development for open source. For instance, Linux would not have triumphed over many other Unixes if IBM had not said, look, here's our logo right next to the penguin. We're making a bet on this. That was incredibly validating 18 years ago when they did it. Well, maybe it was 19 years ago when they did it. And, it made all the difference. So I think it's a good thing that corporations are paying people to work on open source, as long as they understand that at the end of the day, any reputation that's built around that project belongs to the individual developer, not to the company. It's a halo effect to the company, because open source is people and it's individual people, because people change jobs, right? But I'm worried more about, in the sustainability realm, first of all, how can we make sure that maintainer burnout, which is a really big problem, goes away? How can we scale open source, not just more projects, but more people working on the projects? So I started thinking about the need to train younger and younger people to think about software development in an open source way or an inner source way. Right now, inner source, open source are not really taught in universities much. There are a couple of pioneering teams that do that, but mostly it's still the old school way of doing development. In fact, it's hard to learn Agile in a university now, right? So, excuse me. So if we want this to be taught in schools, we have to tip the balance of it being the way that at least most software development is done. And the way to do that is to get companies hooked on the benefits of inner source, which are many, not just the 4 that I outlined. There's a bunch more. And so that's one reason that I think it's going to be super good for open source, because as companies move to inner source, they have to learn collaboration. They have to be interested in that being taught, so that the employees that they hire already know how to do it and are comfortable with it. And that pushes that age lower and lower, that we start teaching how to do this stuff. And, really open source is about all the boats rising and collaboration winning over competition. It's still possible to compete, but why compete on the horizontal stuff? Compete on the verticals, right? All right. But also, we have so many projects now and so few experts that can actually maintain them. As I keep saying, we have real fatigue going on. And I think that dipping into the existing pool of engineers is the fastest way to get people who are willing to work on maintaining projects, because, they're battle tested. They've been in companies. They know about the long haul. And if you have successful software, it's not all invent. There's an awful lot of maintain. I think that the best place we can go to look for that skill, those maintainers, is in the existing pool of engineers. So eventually we end up having inner source and then more open source all over the world. And I think that's what we all want. We want to see all these continents light up, but we want enough people to actually, hold it all up, right? This is a list of companies that talk openly about their inner source journey. And it represents a small percentage of the total companies that are involved in inner source. And I know that because I talk to most of them. These are just people who are willing to be public, so we can quote them. But I want you to notice 2 companies in particular on this list. I mean, there's a pretty broad group here. But look up in the corner there in the left is Microsoft, and then Comcast, right, sort of kitty corner to it. Those are surprising companies, in my opinion, to be on an inner source journey for different reasons. But why they did it is sort of similar. So both of those companies started with a little open source at the edges of the company. And this is a really common pattern. People don't want to go all in on open source. They start out with just one project at the edge. And those engineers have special rights. They're specially able to go do this work on this project, right? Well, after they get a taste of that success, they start wondering if those methods would make them more effective engineers inside the company. And then they want to scale to the rest of the company. And that's what's happening at both Comcast and right now. In Comcast's case, they're doing it to get people ready to do good open source. That's exactly what I was talking about before. They have to first get collaboration going inside the company before they get to push it out, to show that they know how to build community and to collaborate with people that aren't on their team. And then Microsoft is an even more interesting case because, famously, they were the big enemy of open source for a long time, but they have fixed that. And now they want all the engineers at Microsoft to learn how to work in this collaborative way. And that's a sea change. That's the kind of thing that will really build the number of people that are available to maintain projects. So the reason I know those stories in depth is because I run a podcast through my company that is about innersource and what companies are doing with it. And I'll tell you a little bit later how to get to that podcast. This is a graphic that Bosch built for itself that shows cross collaboration within their divisions. So each of those little clusters is a division of the company. And all of the cross connects in the center are collaboration that are happening. They spent years getting to this point of being able to show this graph of how collaboration was flourishing. And that's because it's a really big company. They have a lot of engineers, but also they were all in this lockstep, and they had to gradually teach them that it's okay to do this, to collaborate without, sacrificing the velocity of the company. So I love this graphic, and I'm really grateful to Bosch for letting me use it. This is InnerSource Commons, which is your one-stop shop if you're interested in learning more about InnerSource. This is a nonprofit, or at least we filed for nonprofit status, that it's a community that's been together for about 5 years. And like any open source community, there's a 10x progression of people who are looking to people who are contributing to people who are leading. So you can meet the leaders of the InnerSource movement at innersourcecommons.org. You can find out about events that they're holding. You can find assets like PDF copies of all the books that have been written, including that one I mentioned earlier, and my latest book, and books that other people have written, and academic research all aggregated into one place you can find it. And then work that the community is doing to build training assets that are freely available, and also patterns, to identify patterns. And all of this work is done with a lot of joy. It's really a great community. And you can join it for free by just asking for a Slack account on this front page of innersourcecommons.org. So I hope you guys will go check that out. And now we're coming to the end of my story about how InnerSource is going to help the open source movement. That was absolutely my motivation for bringing it to the fore again. And I'm seeing, not just those two companies I mentioned, but all over town, I'm seeing open source come out of this. So let's join together in the beautiful new future that we're hoping for. And thank you very much. This is the URL to find those podcasts. I think nearform.com/innersource might work as well, but that one will definitely work. My email address, if you want to get a hold of me. And thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about InnerSource and FOSS today. I really enjoy talking, in normal space. That's a lot of my job. And so to have virtual conferences of this kind of gravity show up and have people like me speak is really great. So thanks very much. And I think we might have time for some questions now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Denise. I love all the talk about open source. It's something they talk about a lot on the enterprise side, on the sales side. And I think it's a really good stepping stone to get into open source as well. I thank you so much for that presentation. Also for showing us the cool logo, party in a logo, InnerSource logo. I think it's really cool. I tweeted it out as well for you. So thank you for that.
It is good, isn't it?
I love it. It's on my things I learned thing. So Jared, you've got some questions that are coming through the discussions for us.
We do. And honestly, I want to thank you as well, Denise. I don't have the career that you have had yet, but I do go and talk with enterprises about innersourcing. And, the top topics I usually talk about are how, open collaboration encourages more contributions. You have developers that don't have to start from scratch on new projects. And ultimately, it strengthens the project. But I think something I learned from you is it's a great recruiting tool as well. And I think that's something I'm going to add to my repertoire. So thank you very much for that. But enough about that. We've got some questions on discussions coming in from at Basil or at Basil. Not sure. Is InnerSource the path? I like Basil. Is InnerSource the path to open source?
Well, I think it can be. at the very least, it's going to clean up some of the problems in your engineering organization. But my experience is that something like 75% of the companies that I have worked with, and I'm trying very hard to touch most of them, find that they are better equipped to deal with open source as a holistic thing, not just a weird boutique thing that's happening on the edges of the company. And that's super positive, I think.
Yeah, when you talk about being equipped, what's your kind of take on open source or inner source, in this sense, being more of a cultural thing or just as much a cultural shift as it is a technological shift?
Oh, it's definitely a cultural shift. Yeah, that if it was easy for people to figure out how to do this, they'd just do it. But what we find is each individual company is not collaborating for a different reason. So in some companies, they've concentrated on hiring wizards, or they've grown wizards, and the wizards don't want to share their tricks. That's really a common problem, right? In other companies, everybody's matrixed into time management, and they're basically competing against each other inside the company for resources. So their management won't let them share with other groups because that would be, giving away points in the game somehow. There's lots of different reasons why companies don't collaborate more, but they're usually reasons that also lead to bad habits and endemic problems that are hurting the company, creating technical debt or giving them liability because they just don't have good cross-company knowledge about how things work, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that 100%. Stuff, it's a killer to productivity, and I think we have a couple more questions coming in here now. And I think with companies that I talk with a lot, say when we're trying to promote inner source, a lot of what they say is, we just don't do that here, or we're scared of open source. And I'm sure you've heard that once or twice. Yeah, it's not our thing. I'm sure you've heard that once or twice. But I guess for a developer who's in a company like that, what would be your advice to them to try and promote inner source from the inside?
Well, there's lots of different ways to get open source off the ground. And the last book that I wrote year before last with somebody from University of Limerick, Klaus Jan Stoll, who's a researcher, right? So it's sort of academic, but also groovy kind of book. It's a case study book, and it talks about different companies that have gotten to inner source in different ways. And actually, we're getting ready to do another edition of it because we found some more really good patterns and stories about how people get there. But there are companies that get there from a single engineer, literally a single engineer saying, wow, why aren't we reusing code more? Why are we all writing the same code or solving the same problem 1,000 ways? How is that better? And, if it's the right engineer, they can lead a revolution from where they're sitting. Now, eventually they're going to need the support of senior management, but they can get pretty far in showing the value that can be created by shifting to this other way of working just by doing it themselves, solving their own problem first, which open source is basically enlightened self-interest, right? We wanted to be able to make changes so that we could get our own work done faster rather than relying on other people to have time to do it. It's agency being, manifest. And in companies, a lot of culture has beaten that out of the engineers. And I think that's unfortunate because they're so much better if they have a little agency. But it's also possible that senior management decides this is a good idea. And, usually the groundlings are into it too. It's usually middle management that's stuck on defending the existing castle at all costs. But if you show the value that you can create, you can completely blow through that. So there you go.
I really love that. Just lead a revolution, just like one man band. Let's go. Let's lead the revolution. I think we're
getting the band back together.
Get the band back together. Start recruiting, sending out pamphlets. I love it. Just the image of that is just so cool. But I think we have time for one or two more questions, Jared. What's coming through the discussions at the moment?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a question from Tarexo25. This person says, we are pushing InnerSource for DevOps libraries. It tends to be a secondary job for our staff. How do we convince management to fund or dedicate people to maintain InnerSource projects? Sounds like the
Leader
revolution.
revolution!
Yeah, there you go. By the way, DevOps is one of the prime movers for inner-source adoption right now because everybody has to do it from scratch. There is no just add water and you have DevOps solution. You have to fit it to your culture and your organization. So you got a choice. You can do all of it yourself, every single team doing their own integration, their own deployment characteristics, or you can do it once for the company, or you can do just the deployment once and then let everybody integrate. There's lots of different ways to get there, but it's an opportunity for code reuse that we don't see come through very often. So yay you for doing that. And I think what you need to do is be able to demonstrate again the value that you're creating for the company by doing inner source. And come over to the discussions group and we'll talk about it some more, okay?
Oh, Denise is all over it.
Yes.
Just come over to discussions.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. As Denise said, she's going to be over in the discussions for the next half an hour. Now, before you go, Denise, you've tuned in all the way from Ireland. I know it's so late there, so thank you so much for staying up with us and providing all that amazing knowledge on inner source. So thank you very much.
Thank you so
thanks
much,
for the
Denise.
opportunity. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Our pleasure. Bye.